A sharp, intelligent young woman meets a wealthy, reserved man at a dance, decides almost immediately that he is arrogant and unpleasant, and spends much of the following months convinced she has him completely figured out. He, in turn, dismisses her and her family as beneath him, and both of them are wrong about each other and about themselves. That is the engine of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, published in 1813. And underneath the romance and the wit and the period costumes lies one of the sharpest studies ever written of a problem that has only grown more dangerous in 2026. The problem of how quickly we decide who someone is, how confidently we trust those snap judgments, and how rarely we ever go back and check whether we were right. Here is what feels strange about how we read this beloved book. We treat it primarily as a romance, a will-they, won't-they between Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, and as a comedy of manners about marriage in a particular society. And it is delightfully both of those things. But Austen, one of the most precise observers of human psychology who ever lived, was really writing about something deeper and more universal. She was writing about the two mental habits in her very title: pride, the distortion in how we see ourselves, and prejudice, the distortion in how we see others. The love story is the vehicle. The actual subject is the way human beings construct confident, detailed, and often completely wrong stories about each other based on almost nothing, and then defend those stories against all evidence. Let me reframe the whole novel. Elizabeth Bennet is intelligent, perceptive, and proud of her ability to read people, and that pride is exactly what undoes her. Because she reads Darcy quickly, decides he is proud and disagreeable, and then, crucially, interprets everything that follows through the lens of that first judgment. When she hears damaging stories about him, she believes them instantly, because they confirm what she already concluded. When he behaves in ways that might contradict her view, she explains them away. Austen is showing you with surgical precision how a first impression becomes a prison. Once Elizabeth has decided who Darcy is, she stops actually seeing him and starts seeing only her story about him. And the more confident she is in her own judgment, the harder it becomes for the truth to get through. To feel how sharp Austen's insight is, notice that the turning point of the entire book is not a grand romantic gesture. It is a moment of painful self-recognition. When Elizabeth finally receives information that shatters her version of events, her reaction is not just surprise at Darcy, it is horror at herself. She realizes that she, who prided herself on her discernment, had been blind, that her confidence in her own judgment was the very thing that blinded her, that she had courted prejudice and driven reason away. This is the real climax of the novel, and it has nothing to do with romance. It is the moment a person discovers that the story they were so sure of was a story they wrote, not a truth they found. Austen treats that discovery as the beginning of real wisdom. Psychology has spent the last century cataloging exactly the errors Austen dramatized. We now have names for them: confirmation bias, the tendency to notice and believe whatever supports what we already think, and to dismiss whatever contradicts it; the fundamental attribution error, the habit of explaining other people's behavior in terms of their character, while excusing our own as a product of circumstance; first impression anchoring, the way an initial judgment colors everything we perceive afterward. Elizabeth Bennet commits every one of these, brilliantly and believably, and so does Darcy. Austen had no access to this research. She simply watched human beings with extraordinary care and saw the machinery clearly. The book, in a sense, is a psychology textbook disguised as a romance, and a far more enjoyable one.
Now bring this into 2026, because the problem Austen identified has been weaponized at a scale she could never have imagined. We live in an environment engineered to produce instant, confident judgments of other people based on almost nothing. A single photo, a short clip, one out-of-context sentence, a stranger's worst moment captured and shared, and we decide in seconds exactly who that person is, and we are certain we are right. We form Elizabeth's confident prejudice constantly, dozens of times a day, about people we will never meet and never understand, and we almost never go back and check. Worse, the systems we use are built to feed us more of whatever confirms the judgment we already made. Austen's lesson that confident first impressions are often confidently wrong, and that wisdom begins when you are willing to revise them, has never been more urgently needed than in an age built to make us judge fast and never look again.
There is an idea in Uzbek culture that you cannot know a person until you have shared bread with them, until you have actually spent time in their presence, because the truth of someone is not visible from a distance. It is the precise antidote to Elizabeth's error and to ours. Real knowledge of a person takes time, contact, and the humility to let them surprise you. The confident judgment formed at a glance, at a dance, in a single clip, is almost always a story we wrote, not a person we know. Austen and that old wisdom agree completely. The people we are most sure we have figured out are usually the ones we have understood the least. But here is what makes the book ultimately hopeful rather than merely critical, and it is the part worth holding on to. Both Elizabeth and Darcy change. That is the real love story, deeper than the romance. They each confront their distortion. Elizabeth her prejudice, Darcy his pride, and they each do the genuinely difficult work of revising their view of themselves and each other. Austen is not just diagnosing the disease of false judgment, she is showing you the cure, and it is not cleverness, it is humility. It is the willingness to say, I was wrong about this person and about myself, and to let new evidence actually change your mind. The reason Elizabeth and Darcy end up worthy of each other is not that they were right about each other from the start. It is that they were both capable of growing past being wrong. In a culture that treats changing your mind as weakness, Austen presents it as the very thing that makes love and wisdom possible. I want to add a brief, gentle word, because the lesson here can tip into harsh self-criticism, an endless second-guessing of every judgment you have ever made. That is not the point. Austen is not asking you to distrust all your perceptions or to never form a view of anyone. She is asking for something lighter and wiser, a held humility, an awareness that your first impressions are stories subject to revision, and a willingness to update them gracefully when the evidence changes. This is not about being paralyzed by doubt. It is about holding your judgments of people a little more loosely, leaving room for them to be more or different than you first assumed, and extending to others the same benefit of the doubt you would want for yourself. Read Pride and Prejudice again, not as a charming period romance, but as one of the most precise books ever written about the stories we construct about other people and the confidence with which we get them wrong. It gives you language for pride and prejudice as the twin distortions in how we see ourselves and others, for the prison of the first impression, for the humility that real understanding requires. And it leaves you with a question worth carrying into every interaction in our judge-at-a-glance age. How many people have you completely figured out, filed away, decided about, based on almost nothing? Austen spent a whole novel showing that the person you are most certain about may be the one you have understood the least, and that wisdom begins the moment you become willing to read them again.
There is a further dimension to Austen's genius that is worth drawing out, because it concerns not just how we judge others, but how we resist correcting ourselves. Notice how hard Elizabeth fights internally against the evidence that she was wrong. When the truth about Darcy first reaches her, her instinct is not immediate acceptance, it is defensiveness, the desperate search for a way to keep her original story intact. Because admitting she was wrong about him means admitting she was wrong about herself, about her prized ability to read people. Austen understood that the hardest thing about revising a judgment is not the new information, it is the blow to our ego that revision requires. We are not just attached to our opinions of other people, we are attached to the image of ourselves as people who judge well, and changing our minds threatens that image. This is why being wrong feels less like a simple update and more like a small death. In 2026, this insight is more relevant than ever, because we now form our judgments publicly, declaring our opinions of people and situations out loud to audiences, which makes them even harder to revise. Once you've publicly decided who someone is, changing your mind feels like a humiliating reversal in front of everyone watching. And so we dig in, defending conclusions we secretly suspect are wrong, precisely because backing down feels like losing face. Austen offers the antidote in the very structure of Elizabeth's growth. The turning point of her life is the moment she chooses the discomfort of admitting error over the false comfort of defending her pride. She lets the truth cost her something, and in doing so, she becomes wiser, freer, and ultimately capable of a love she would otherwise have thrown away. The willingness to say, "I was wrong," Austen suggests, is not a weakness that diminishes you. It is the single most important skill for becoming a person who sees clearly, and it is the rarest and most valuable form of courage there is. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been completely wrong about someone after a confident first impression, and what finally changed your mind? If you want more deep dives that turn the stories you think you know inside out, subscribe and check the description for further reading. One honest note before you go. This video uses AI-generated audio and visuals, and it offers reflection, not professional advice. This was just one reader's thoughts, offered to make you think.